Hey, it's Molly here. Now, before we dive in, I want to give a shout out to our awesome sponsor, InvestorKit. At Ladies Finance Club, we are all about helping women crush financial independence, and property investing is a really smart way to do this. But let's be real, figuring out the right location, avoiding costly mistakes, and dealing with agents, it's a lot. That's where InvestorKit comes in. They've been named Australia's Buyer Agency of the Year in 2023 and 2024, and they're here to look after you, the property investor. They know the markets inside out, back every move with solid data, and take care of the tricky stuff like research, negotiation, and even connecting you with top property managers. Whether it's your first investment property or you're building your portfolio, InvestorKit makes it simple and stress-free. Big thanks to them for supporting this podcast. Visit investorkit.com.au to learn more. I had a chat with the awesome John Cadogan from Auto Expert, and it was like talking to your super knowledgeable dad about cars. So he is the real deal. He's got a mechanical engineering degree. He's been covering all things car industries for the last 25 years on radio, online, and TV. And he's also got over 415 YouTube subscribers, and we'll pop the link where you can check out his YouTube if you want to learn more about cars. So in this episode, we chatted all thing cars, and I got to ask all my car questions like, am I better to go secondhand or buy new? What about the rise of EVs? Is it better to go for an EV? What are the things I need to think about? Should I buy it outright or should I go through financing? And what are just the biggest mistakes he sees people make when it comes to purchasing a car? Oh, and we also talked about insurance as well, car insurances. So remember, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It takes 2 seconds and it means we can keep bringing on awesome guests like John onto the podcast. Now, let's rev those engines and drive on into today's podcast with John. Hey, John, thanks for coming on the show today.
It's my pleasure, Molly. Thanks for having me.
So this is a topic I'm pretty keen to learn more about because I had a little incident this year with my car where it burnt to the ground. Well, it didn't burn to the ground, but it caught on fire. So it was written off. And yeah, now I'm looking to buy a new car. So I have quite a few questions, but I also reached out to our community and they also had questions as well. So I'm just going to hit you with a couple, jump straight into it. And my first question is, new or secondhand? So when I'm looking to buy a car, I'm now going, do I want to buy new? Because I know cars depreciate the minute you drive them at the store. So what should I be thinking about when I'm thinking about new or secondhand?
Okay, so the advantage of a new car is you don't have to worry about abuse or neglect by the previous owner. And obviously, the second law of thermodynamics pertains as well, which just basically says that everything's a clock and therefore it wears out over time. So if you buy a new car, in addition to the new car smell, you get the best reliability that you're going to get with that make and model. And the older the car, if you buy it used, the more likely that you're going to have substantial failures that cost you heaps down the track, right? So that's a problem. And as you've said, nothing in life is free. So the price you pay for that is A, more upfront cost, and B, the steepest depreciation, because the depreciation is the most severe initially. And then over time, probably 2 or 3 years down the track, the depreciation kind of tapers off. So you've just got to balance that up. I mean, nobody who wants a new car and can afford a new car really thinks about buying a used car because the acquisition cost is not trivial but acceptable to them. And most people who buy used cars tend to do it in the context of economic necessity. They need transportation, but they haven't got the budget for a new car.
Okay, great. And so if I was scanning like carsales.com, what are key things you would look out for if someone did decide to go down that secondhand route?
Well, the most painful aspect of buying a used car is fraud. So you've got to insulate yourself against those kinds of things which can just cost you heaps. So in addition to checking out the mechanical health and well-being of any used car, and you should do that by conscripting a trusted mechanic. If you find a car that you're on the cusp of falling in love with in the used market, you should take it to a trusted mechanic or get the trusted mechanic to visit that car with you and give it a once-over for a basic health check. Now, The other thing you should do is use one of those revs check kind of online services where you can input the rego number and the VIN code and other data about the car and just make sure that it's not a repaired write-off or something that's been rebirthed or any of those tragedies that could be easily sort of avoided.
Awesome. And what was that website?
There's a revs check. You could just Google the term revs check, and there's a whole bunch of third parties that offer essentially a similar service. But what you need to do is you need to know the VIN code, which is like the car's DNA. It's a unique 17-digit alphanumeric identifier for that specific car. And once you know that, you can crack the code on a lot of that car's past.
Yes, I learned all about the VIN code when mine burnt down.
I'm sure you did.
Yes. A lot about the actual insurance process as well, which was interesting. And so are there certain brands that do better? Because I know it was during COVID where we saw like secondhand, because it was so hard to get, I think, new cars, secondhand cars went up in value quite a bit. So are there like certain brands we should be looking out for?
Depreciation is, in a sense, a bit brand specific. If you buy one of these emerging brands that haven't been here for very long, then you should expect the depreciation to be pretty high. Whereas Toyota, which I jokingly refer to on my channel as the king of mediocrity because they do the minimum required to be Australia's number one car maker, they tend to hold on to their value really well. Like a secondhand Hilux is like gold. They retain their value amazingly, and the depreciation is basically just representative of supply and demand in the market, right? So if there's a high demand for a particular brand in the used market, then its retained value will be high, which is bad for you if you're in the market to buy one, but it's good for you if you've got one and you've owned it for a few years and you want to sell it because you'll get more than somebody else who bought a less attractive brand.
Awesome. If someone's listening to this and they're like, John, I've got 15K, what would you do in my situation? Could you just talk us through maybe what you would do?
It also depends on you and how you want to drive and the kind of driving you need to do. Because if you're a mum with 3 kids, then you need a different car than if you're a single young lady just living in the inner city and driving occasionally. In fact, you could probably just get by with Uber if that was you in the latter sense. But if you've got 15 grand and you've got the regulation 2 kids, you want to run to the shops, take the kids to school, do whatever else you do, and it's just mundane driving, buy something like a Corolla, like a Toyota Corolla or a Mazda 3, because nearly everyone can work on them and the parts are relatively cheap. There's lots of third-party aftermarket parts that are not necessarily Toyota branded, so that you can get repairs done reasonably cost effectively, and they're not going to cost you heaps anyway, and they're reasonably reliable. Now, I appreciate that cars are also, in addition to being transportation and logistics, they're also, for many people, a fashion accessory, and Toyota Corolla is not that. It's not a Lady Dior handbag of transportation, is it, right? So there's a balance there as well. If you want a fashion accessory, it's going to cost you a lot more. I'm not so sure that people actually pay that much attention to you and what car you drive. It's probably more important to you. But if you want to go down the fashion accessory track, it's going to cost you a hell of a lot more.
Awesome. And so we're seeing the rise of EVs. So let's say your budget was a little more, not unlimited, but it was higher. Between the choice of an EV or, a diesel car, what are we likely to see? Are we going to see the rise of the EV? And do you think that would be a better investment?
We have seen the rise of EVs. They've started from nowhere and they're on the cusp of achieving probably 100,000 battery EV sales over the next few years per annum. So that's good in a sense, but EVs are not right for everyone. Yeah. If you haven't got off-street parking, charging an EV is a big problem because you will have to use public chargers and they're often out of service or in great demand during holiday periods. And, if you drive long distances, there was a story where a journalist from, I'm going to say the Daily Mail, it was one of those online newspapers like that, drove a Hyundai Ioniq 5 to Melbourne. And it took her like twice as long and cost twice as much as doing the equivalent trip, which she does all the time in her Toyota Corolla. And the reason it took a lot longer was she had to keep stopping to charge, and she had to do that at times in locations that made her feel quite vulnerable because she was isolated and she had a kid and a dog with her in the car. So I'm also pretty certain that EVs are going to depreciate much more heavily than conventional cars because we're not going to see a full transition or even a mostly full transition to EVs anytime soon because they're just not the right solution for most people.
Okay. And with the EVs, out of the EV range, who, in your opinion, is kind of the leader? Is it the Teslas or is it the Beyond Your Dreams?
Okay, so Tesla is the Coca-Cola of EVs. And although I'm kind of very critical of Elon Musk and I call him Electric Jesus all the time because that's kind of who he is, he done one thing really magically well that nobody else historically had managed, which is he made electric cars cool. And Tesla is that fashion accessory EV brand. If you want to show your environmental credentials on your sleeve in front of everyone else, buy a Tesla. The Model Y is the most popular EV in Australia, and I think it's the top-selling EV around the world as well. So Tesla is up there in terms of its brand credibility for that niche of people who really want an EV.
Are there any upcoming ones where you think they're pretty good, but they might not have the branding?
MG is pretty good. The MG4 is a pretty solid EV, but frankly, we are going to see an absolute explosion of EVs from China. I spent the second week of 2025 in China, and I could not believe, like I've been playing the automotive game as a journalist for about 35 years, so shortly after the extinction of the dinosaurs, I started doing this, and the number of EVs in China is remarkable because they give people such an incentive to buy them over there. And also the number of brands and vehicles that I couldn't identify without sort of walking around and looking at the badge. So we're going to see an absolute explosion of Chinese vehicles. And I'd suggest that maybe 30%, 40% of Australians over the next 5 to 10 years are going to be driving Chinese cars.
Okay, there we go. So jumping back to secondhand diesel, like petrol cars, actually that just brings me to another question. Petrol or diesel, is there a big difference between the two?
I think the biggest thing about petrol versus diesel is that if you don't drive often on the freeway, diesels can be operationally problematic because you need to regenerate a thing called the particle filter, and it can only do that at highway sort of cruising speeds. So if you're living in the inner city, commuting to work and doing only short distance trips, petrol is probably a better idea for you. But I'd suggest if that's you, you probably want to look at buying a hybrid because that's the segment, like hybrids and plug-in hybrids. There's a slight distinction between these two, but they have absolutely boomed in percentage terms, admittedly off a fairly low base, but they boomed over the past few years. And with a plug-in hybrid, if you're doing short distance trips, you can basically drive in EV mode for your normal commuting to the shops and to the school and to work and things like that. But if you need to drive interstate or into the regions, you can just fill the tank up with petrol and drive as long as you've got petrol in the tank, and you don't need to worry about where's the next public charger and is it in service and are there 6 people waiting when I get there?
Okay, so with those, so I guess I am my best customer here because I don't really know what that is, a hybrid. So I'm assuming that's where you can choose whether you charge it, but also it has gas or petrol or diesel in it.
Okay, there's 2 kinds of hybrids. They've all got a combustion side, like a conventional petrol engine, but they've also got an electric side. And the basic hybrid, which is like a RAV4 hybrid or a Corolla hybrid, just operates in the background and you don't need to do anything. And basically all it does is it uses a relatively small battery and relatively small electric motor to catch kinetic energy. So if you're driving along and the lights go red up in front and you take your foot off the gas, then it starts to absorb that kinetic energy, like the speed energy you've got, and it pumps it into the battery, and you get to use it again to get going when the light goes green and thereby save a little bit of fuel. That's your basic hybrid. Your plug-in hybrid has a much bigger battery and a much bigger set of electrical motors and gear like that. And you can plug it in overnight and operate it as a pure EV for some tens of kilometres in the morning if you want to. And then you can just drive it continuously interstate as well if you need to get a long distance from A to B and not worry about charging up, because you don't have to plug them in. It's just something you should do at home if opportunity presents.
Awesome. And who's kind of leading the market in that category?
The darling of plug-in hybrids is probably is Mitsubishi. Their Eclipse Cross and Outlander plug-in hybrids are long-term winners here. There's a lot of plug-in hybrid action happening, though. We're going to see a bunch of utes that are plug-in hybrids from China enter the market this year, so that's going to set the ute market on its ear. I'm not sure how many of your listeners and viewers are in the market for a blue singlet dual cab ute, but
I'm going to make a guess that it's probably not a huge amount.
You never know. You never know. There's equal opportunity in vehicles as well as everything else now, so that's good.
All right. Let's say I can't get a mechanic to come along, but I found this car I like on car sales. I'm checking it out. What are some things I should check? Like, I know someone once told me about the wheels and see how old the wheels are, because that's something that you can negotiate on. What are some areas that, and I'm being stereotypical here, like as women, I can't say I've had a huge interest in cars in my life. I wasn't pulling them apart, putting them back together. So my knowledge is quite low. What are some little things I can be aware of?
The first thing that anyone can do, and you don't need any specific mechanical knowledge to do this, is just open the owner's compendium that you get with every car and have a look at the service record, because cars need to be serviced on time. And the pro tip there is it's the time or the distance, whichever comes first. So if the service schedule says 15,000 Ks or 1 year, and that car's 6 years old and it's only had 4 services, run away.
Okay.
Right? Because the servicing is an obligation to maintain the warranty. And just because the previous owner abused the car, that's going to be your problem if you buy it. Because if the engine has some sort of catastrophic failure and the car hasn't been serviced properly, the manufacturer is going to throw you under the bus and the bill is going to be 25 grand for a new engine. So the service history is a big thing to check. The other, you can check the tyres, as you said. If there's a lot of wear or uneven wear on the tyres, then you'd want to get that looked at. If the engine's running rough, or you take it for a brief test drive and it pulls to one side or it vibrates, it does the Cinvitus dance down the road, whatever, then they're indications that something is awry and needs to be addressed at least before you start negotiating about it. But frankly, a lot of this stuff is pretty specialised, and if you're thinking about spending $15,000 or $20,000, that's going to be a lot of money for you. When people buy a car, it's always a lot of money for them, except for the uber wealthy. And you must find $150-ish for a mechanic to just pass their expert eye over that car, because the cost, it could be 100-fold return on investment.
Yeah. Okay, great. And I guess as well, when I take a car to a service, sometimes they're like, your car needs this, 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 and this. Generally, should we take the word of the mechanic, or are they generally trying to upsell us on a few things? Should we get second opinions?
To be perfectly stereotypical here, I think there is a class of automotive business that sees a woman walk through the door and they just go, ka-ching. Right? Because they go, she's not going to know anything about this car. I'm going to say this with a straight face, and this will be another several $100s for us. And that is prolific. I hear that all the time. I've had plenty of people reach out to me, and clearly they're just being ripped off. So I think the best thing to do when it comes to dealing with automotive businesses is something that women are great at typically and men are terrible at, which is networking with your friends and having conversations about which mechanic you like and which mechanic you hated. And that's the way to do it, because otherwise you're just playing Russian roulette.
Nice. Yeah, good advice there. And insurances. So I luckily had all my insurances, but actually what was interesting was a lot of people were like, your car was quite old. Why did you have comprehensive? So what's the rule of thumb with insurance? Like, obviously in Australia, we all have to have third-party insurance, but should you always get comprehensive?
If you've got a cheap car, it's really cheap. It's a bit of a bomb. You don't need to comprehensively insure it because it's probably only worth a few $1,000s. And if it gets damaged and written off, then you can probably cop that on the chin. And if you don't write your car off religiously once a year, then after 5 or 6 years of paying the insurance, you'll probably be in front. What's really important, though, is to have enough insurance so that if you crash into a Lamborghini, it doesn't cost you the house,
Yeah.
right? Or if you injure somebody and they've got some claim against you, then you really need insurance that covers all of that kind of third-party damage. Now, the third-party insurance kind of that comes with your registration, that's really just for people getting injured, okay? It doesn't cover you if you crash into someone's Mercedes-Benz. So you really need that third-party property damage, third-party fire and theft, I think they call it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember speaking to a debt counselor, and this guy had hit a car, which had hit another car, which had hit another car, and pretty much bankrupted him because he didn't have the proper insurances in place. So if you're listening, make sure you check your insurances and you have enough cover, because it's I guess it's what can happen. And apparently hitting power poles as well can be really expensive because the power companies charge you a lot.
Yeah, it's pretty sobering because if you hit a power pole and it's your fault because you were driving negligently or something, which if you crash just for no reason into a power pole, the cops will go you for negligent driving. But the utility company, the first thing they'll do, you can be in hospital in traction and you'll get a bill for the replacement of a power pole, which not cheap, not fun. Just make it your insurance's problem by having the appropriate cover. The other thing to realise, though, is that your insurance doesn't cover everything. You know, if you're completely irresponsible, like you're driving drunk, for example, you're not going to be insured. And a lot of people discover that for the very first time when they're in that situation. And I'd suggest that you're probably better off thinking about, in that situation, you can sit in court and go to a traffic day and just look at the endless cascade of people flowing in through the courtroom who just drive like irresponsible muppets, and they're among us in society. And you need to cross that bridge and not behave like that. But you also need to say that that person's not going to have insurance because they're driving like that. And I can't make a claim against them. If they've got no assets, there's no point suing them. I'm going to have to rely on my own insurance, which is another reason to have that insurance.
Wow, that's such a good point. I did not think of that. So get your insurance is the key takeaway of just that conversation then. And then when it comes to buying a car, if you're in the position where you can buy a car outright or you can get it on a loan, how does that work? Because I hear people say, oh, well, on a car loan, you pay so much more in the end.
The cheapest way to buy a car is to have the cash in the bank and just buy it, but very few people have that.
Yeah.
The trap, I think, with car finance is that the whole car industry is geared this way to get people to spend more money than they can afford. So a car dealer, for example, is going to be quite happy to ramp you up on the finance and get you paying a loan that is borderline insolvency for you. They won't care. And you see the car, it's very sexy, you like it, you go, I want that. And they'll say, we can make that easy for you, sign here, and you do, and it's really hard to make the payments. So your spending capacity and your repayment capacity is very important to have in the front of your mind when you're in a dealership, because they make it so easy to spend so much more than you really want to. I mean, so many people walk out of the dealership and go, blah, 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 what just happened, right? Yeah. And you don't want to be in that position if it's your own cash, or even more dramatically in some instances, if it's cash that you just borrowed and you wondered why you kept saying yes.
Yeah, because I do see younger people with these very expensive cars, which on finance. And I think, wow, that must be such a chunk of their income going towards that. So do you have any, and it's okay if you don't, but do you have any examples of like what figures would be? So like if you got a $50,000 car on finance, what those repayments might look like?
I don't have the figures off the top of my head, but I do know that, for example, that you can go to any of the major banks on their websites and look up car loans, and the interest rate is just extortionate, even in the context of home loans being whatever they are, 6 or 7% or something, then you'll easily be paying double that on a car loan. And some people even roll their car finance into their mortgage by dipping into their mortgage. And the problem with that, obviously, is that you start paying your car off over 25 years, only you're not going to own it for probably more than 5 or 10. And if you keep doing that, then the repayment horizon for your mortgage just keeps getting pushed back and back and back.
Yeah. And this was another question that came through with one of our members. When buying a secondhand car, what kind of mileage do we want to, anything over X amount, avoid? Is there like a certain over 20,000 kilometers, don't go there? Or is there a certain rule of thumb there?
Average vehicles in Australia do just under 15,000 Ks a year. So let's say 15.
Yeah.
I think the sweet spot for buying a used car, if you can afford it, is about 3 years old. So if you can find a 3-year-old car with 40 or 50,000 Ks on the clock, it should have more or less another 90 to 100,000 Ks of relatively trouble-free mileage. I mean, obviously there's wear and tear, tyres and brakes, things like that you can't really escape from. That wear and tear just happens. But you should have maybe another 5 years of relatively trouble-free motoring without extortionate repair bills, failed engines and transmissions and things of that nature. And obviously, this is economic dependent, right? Your spending capacity dictates how new the used car that you're going to buy can be. And when you've got lower spending capacity, you've got to buy an older car, and the potential for really expensive problems really is driven up. You'd have to say on the far side of about 100, 120,000 Ks on the clock, You've got to be expecting the bad news without warning, because, 120,000 Ks is 4 laps of planet Earth, or 3 laps of planet Earth. That's a lot of driving, right? It's 40,000 kilometres around the Earth. So people say to me all the time, but my car's only done 160,000 Ks. And I go, dude, that's 4 laps of the planet. How much more reliable would you like it?
Oh my gosh, there you go. Well, that was all my questions for now. Is there anything that you think we've missed, John, or anything that you would like the audience to know?
Cars are a big topic, obviously, but if the thing is finance, then cars really are transportation. And the biggest trap that I see people make is that they buy a car that they really can't afford because of some often spurious perception of status that is attached to the make and the model. And I think ultimately you'd be happier if you could just get the status concept and put it over there and say, what do I need instead of what do I want? I think there'd be a lot more happy motorists out there.
Yes, no. And as the founder of Ladies Finance Club, I couldn't agree more. Instead of spending that money on a car, spend that money working on yourself and understanding why the status means so much to you. John, thank you so much for coming and talking to Ladies Finance Club, sharing all your wonderful car knowledge and wisdom. So many golden nuggets of information there.
Nice to talk to you, Molly. Thanks a lot.